Welcome to NightCAP. It's January 25th.
It's time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics. I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
And tonight we're joined by Meredith Baum and we have Matthew Griswold, both NightCAP first timers. Thank you so much for joining us. The government is back open after last week's shutdown. The LA Times captured the event perfectly. They led an article with this quote: "In the end, it was neither self-proclaimed deal-making, President Trump, nor seasoned congressional leaders who found the path to end the three-day government shutdown. Instead, we saw this good work coming from the so-called Common Sense Coalition, a group of moderate Democrats, including one of my favorites, Susan Collins, who was recently referred to as Switzerland during the shutdown, that actually reached that deal to reopen the government. Congress now has until February 8th to reach a spending deal."
Yeah, and Fallon, really a tale of two parties. I think quite objectively we can say that this was a win for McConnell, at least legislatively. We see him back to his best, possibly shoring up the support of his party ahead of a potential leadership vote. And really that's a question that's going to be asked of Chuck Schumer as well. Just a quick Quinnipiac poll from a couple days ago on blame for the shutdown after it ended. 32% Democrats in Congress, 31% President Trump, 18% Republicans in Congress. So an interesting breakdown there, certainly not really placing blame squarely on one group. But on Schumer's side, it's really unclear to me, and we're going to talk about that for sure today, what Schumer and his party got in exchange for shutting down the government, besides really a lot of headaches for particularly battleground senators in states that Trump won, as well as sort of tough questions for those who are interested in running for president. And if you don't believe me, check out the print cover of Politico from Tuesday morning. It had 4 out of 4 front page headlines that essentially boiled down to Democrats losing the battle on the shutdown.
Yeah, that was definitely pretty wild coming out of Politico. But I'm curious to see what our panel thinks of the outcome of this government shutdown. Meredith, let's start with you.
You know, I think it was a hard moment for the Democrats, but now they have Chip out of the way, so when they're negotiating again, that's not an object that the Republicans can hold over their head. And they got Mitch McConnell to say on the floor that he's going to bring a vote about DACA in 3 weeks, and so I think they just brought more recognition to the subject, and hopefully in 3 weeks they can get something done.
Yeah, Matthew, what do you think?
I mean, I think I'd be careful before running to call this a win for Republicans. Historically, no one really likes shutdowns. And in the poll you just mentioned, while it is split between Trump and the Republicans, the majority of people still lay the blame on Democrats. And I think when we talk about shutdowns, historically, independents, moderates really dislike it, so they're playing to their base here. And I think that in terms of messaging, people are giving Republicans the win. You know, the House stayed together, the Freedom Caucus didn't pull anything, Trump kept his mouth shut. But February 8th isn't a long time away, and I think this could be I think this could be a very short-lived win if we're going to chalk that up to a win for the Republicans. So I think there's a lot of heavy lifting and very little consensus on where to go forward with immigration.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And when we look at the messaging, that battle that's still playing out, I mean, Matthew, particularly when you talk about the way that the Republicans, I think you mentioned, successfully branded this shutdown as, in many ways, sort of prioritizing the DACA illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants above keeping the government open, right? They were sort of successful in winning that messaging war, or maybe they weren't. You can discuss. How do you see that playing out going into the midterms in places where Democrats have to win, in the middle of the country, places they have to win in order to get the House back?
I mean, well, if you look at a case like Montana, Joe Tester actually voted against the second vote to reopen the government. They're really going to try and hang that over his head when he's up for re-election in a Trump state. But I think that each vote is going to be something that the representative is going to take to his or her district or state, and I think that people are certainly going to remember the shutdown, but there's going to be immigration, and there are going to be a lot of more fights after this. So I think that it's premature to start calling 2018 races based on where people voted on the shutdown. But certainly some good ammunition for Republicans if you're running as a blue candidate in a red state.
Well, and Tester is a good example because Tester essentially, so you're talking about he voted against that stopgap spending bill in which there was a 6-year extension for CHIP, right? And so that's exactly what you're talking about. That's going to be a big problem going forward. And so Meredith, you mentioned CHIP. Is it a bad calculus essentially for the Democrats to abandon that narrative by essentially having to, in order to keep the shutdown going, vote against bills that would have extended that program?
No, I don't think so. I think that the Democrats made it really clear that immigration was their priority, and it wasn't that they were prioritizing it over CHIP. It just that's what they were trying to focus on here, and Republicans were trying to push it off and push it off and push it off. And the Democrats really wanted to try and get a deal done before DACA expires in March.
Meredith, what I'm really curious here, we were talking earlier about how this was a big, I guess you could call it a W for McConnell, but we only have 2 weeks left till we get to that February 8th deadline. So how do you think that this is going to play out? I know that you're interested in the GOP and how it works today. How do you think that this is going to play out for the GOP, assuming that Mitch McConnell keeps his word?
Well, I don't think you can assume that Mitch McConnell would keep his word, especially since he doesn't do that within his own party, so I don't know why he would do that with the Democrats. But I think it's going to be a hard battle, and I don't not necessarily know if he's going to bring a vote to the floor, and if he doesn't, I think that's going to look really bad on Republicans, because now they've publicly stated that this is something that they're going to do on February 8th, and most people want like some sort of pathway for DACA.
Sure, even Trump said that recently.
Right, and the Republican base, and so I think it's kind of baffling that Republican politicians aren't more supportive of this.
Do you want to chime in on this?
Well, I think Meredith makes a good point, and more importantly, I mean, it seems like that is where we're getting, and time will tell whether McConnell keeps his word. But it does seem, this is an 80-20 issue, the Dreamers bill, and so I think it is poison. I hope it's not, but I think it would be poison to not meet Democrats halfway on that. And I think we'll see how that plays out. But we do want to talk about, we teased this a little bit, Schumer's future. So a lot of talk in the last year or so. I've heard, you hear Senate candidates, primary candidates talking about, we're not sure if we're going to support Mitch McConnell as majority leader. Personally, I think that the groundswell within the Democratic caucus on the Senate side has really hit a peak, and I think a lot of them are sort of starting to get a little bit disenchanted with Schumer's leadership. I mean, Meredith, do you feel that happening? Do you sense that perhaps you could see a Tim Ryan sort of person step up and maybe try and challenge Schumer next time there's a leadership vote?
I can't say for sure, but I would hope that the Democratic Party sticks together as one, and I think that's going to be really important. And I think just because you saw a little bit of fraction in the party right now between some of the more moderate people, or maybe some of the people that are up for re-election in 2018, trying to really stick with their base and focus on that election, versus some of the people that are trying to maybe get elected in 2020. I don't think that really says anything huge. I think the Democratic Party has one thing in mind, and that's taking back the Senate, and I think that's going to be the most important thing.
Yeah, and certainly, those Senate candidates or those presidential hopefuls aren't making it any easier for Schumer either. So it's not an easy job at all.
I'm just curious too. Another thing that we saw coming out of this whole shutdown was the Twitter war. I mean, we talk about Twitter all the time, but we saw those hashtags. It was hashtag Schumer shutdown, hashtag Trump shutdown. Can we say that this shutdown was clearly one party's fault? I mean, Grizz, what do you think about this?
I think it would be tough to say a shutdown is any one party's fault. You can try and shift the blame as much as you like, but in both cases, I think that you really have a failure of leadership from the White House. I think that the White House is the one that's supposed to shepherd these things through, and they didn't do it, and they sort of pulled back. But talking about splits within the Democratic Party and suddenly lack of support for Schumer, I think that congressional leadership posts are historically not popularity contests in either party. What I think will be the most interesting split is not the Schumer split, but the Senate-House Democrat split. The Senate Democrats have already said they're interested in entertaining a long-term spending bill without any immigration in it. I don't think that's going to fly with House Democrats. You had Steny Hoyer already tell his caucus that he thinks the senators screwed them over. And so I think that if you're looking for real tension, that in the short term at least is what we're going to see in terms of inter-party tension. And I also should note this is probably the first time in memory that the Republicans haven't fractured, and that the Freedom Caucus hasn't shot way out to the right.
Yep.
And left California Republicans and Illinois Republicans just stranded out in the middle there.
That's a great point.
That's a very interesting
And
point.
one thing we get lost. I read a poll at the top of the segment, but for a lot of people, this was a shutdown that started on a Friday or a Thursday and ended on a Sunday. A Monday. Point is, for a lot of people, this really didn't register, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But one thing you mentioned about the leadership problem, I think is really important. And Fallon, we were encouraged. I think everyone was encouraged by that Problem Solvers Caucus sort of, the talking stick and all that. But really getting down to the I don't mean to denigrate that, but
Don't denigrate
getting
Susan Collins
actually
and her talking stick.
a solution on the table in fairly short order. I personally thought that this shutdown was going to last a lot longer. And there's one dynamic that we highlighted that we want to talk to you guys a little bit about, which is Casey Hunt reporting on the tone of this meeting. And of course, the Republican senators in this meeting, not necessarily representative of the caucus on the whole, but essentially making concessions that there are issues, say immigration, say CHIP, where they disagree with the president, or at least what the president's position was 20 minutes ago, and that they are willing to sort of work together with those other moderate Democrats and actually be a force in these discussions moving forward, like they clearly were here. Is that something that gives you cause for potentially more bipartisanship this year? I mean, what do you see happening there?
I think it's always good to hope for bipartisanship, especially with this new little coalition that's forming. However, I'm not sure if their ultimate goal is bipartisanship or if they're really just trying to help their own parties at the end of the day. And I think with Trump as president, it's particularly hard to play the bipartisanship game because he is just such a divisive leader.
And Meredith, one more point that I wanted to make about the Republican Party. I think it's really interesting because we hear all the time that Republicans are not criticizing President Trump enough. But then you have people like Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, Flake on the Senate floor last week criticizing Trump about freedom of the press. You have these people, but then they go and they vote in line with Trump. So what do you think is going to be the significance of the tone of this new Problem Solvers Caucus that we see coming out of this shutdown?
I think it would be significant if they continued to work together and if they continued to collaborate. But like you said, like this past year, you've seen a lot of, not that many, I would hope to have seen more, people critique Trump and then really do nothing about it, still continue to vote with the party line. And so I don't know if they're gonna continue to do this or if they're just gonna put the party above everything else like they had before.
Yeah, and Matthew, one thing we saw, at least in this case, maybe it's just this one instance, but it does seem like the shutdown as a mechanism is sort of losing its efficacy. I mean, they certainly didn't get, at least, personally, I think it's objective. Democrats didn't get what they really wanted, right? A paired spending bill with DACA. So is that a sign that maybe that tool of halting everything to a stop is maybe not going to be used as much in the future, even if we don't get a swell of bipartisanship all the time?
I think that's a good assessment. We've seen, both Republicans and Democrats try the shutdown card, and it hasn't really worked for them in either case. But I don't think that, in terms of getting what they want legislatively, of course, but I don't think that that's a good sign, or necessarily any sign for bipartisanship going forward. I think that so many of the issues that we have coming up, especially immigration, are such emotional and polarizing for each base that it's hard to see, a great meeting in the middle on either of those. And I think what they hopefully will focus on is just the narrowest of bills that they can find some sort of common ground on. But again, I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, well, we're going to hold our breath on that one. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be back with more NightCAP. Stick with us.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. So on our last show, way back, it was like almost 2 months ago now, we were right before the recess, both the congressional one and ours, and we were taking a look back on Trump's first year in the office. So we were still waiting to see. It was right before tax reform. We didn't know whether that was going to pass. We were talking about Congress's huge to-do list. And if I remember correctly, we went around the table, we were grading Trump. It was definitely below a passing grade for his first year. I know, I think we said that Twitter gave him bonus points for his grade. But now that he accomplished tax reform, James, I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways from Trump's first year in office?
Well, absolutely. I think I can't exactly remember what grade. I think it actually was a passing from me. Maybe
I don't
not
know
from
if we
anyone
gave him
else.
actual letters. It just definitely wasn't passing.
Well, agree to disagree.
Majority of this.
Well,
table
and
here.
this is why it's interesting, because it really is a tale of two presidencies at this point. Actually, probably more than two. On the one hand, if you had told me that as a conservative that we would have, Justice Neil Gorsuch in the Supreme Court, a record pace
Gorsuch or Merrick Garland?
No, I got it right. This time I got
Okay.
it right. If you told me that we had Gorsuch, a record pace of lower judicial appointments of true conservatives, you had tax reform, ISIS all but defeated, at least in the sense of the caliphate, the Dow at 26,000, regulatory rollback, and the last few quarters of record economic growth plus upward revisions from banks as well as the IMF, I think that would be a great year. But that said, when we see hundreds of thousands of people marching, united by their dissent, their disapproval of the president, and disapproval is a weak word in this case. When you see the special counsel lining up interviews with the attorney general, potentially getting ready to interview the president, I think we have to qualify that success, at least from my conservative policy perspective.
Right, I agree, but I'm curious to see what other Trump supporters think about his first year. So we're going to turn to a segment that we like to call Two Trumps Up, where we hear voices from Trump supporters. Earlier today, we sat down and we spoke with my grandmother, who voted for Trump and still hopes to see him successful this year. Let's look at that. Hi, Nan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you this evening, Fallon and James.
Welcome.
Okay, so if
Thank
you
you.
could just tell us, how did you think President Trump did in his first year in office?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I'm so impressed with the man's boundless energy and his total commitment to the citizens of this country and working so hard to keep all of his campaign promises.
Okay,
He
well,
really is draining the swamp, and I think the American people are going to see that and appreciate it.
well, it sounds like you think that his 2017 went pretty well. Now we have the State of the Union address that's coming up this Tuesday. How do you think he's going to do this year in 2018?
Well, I think one of the most important things for him to accomplish this year is the DACA situation. Those kids only know this country as their home. They were brought here as children and with their illegal parents. And we have to have a plan formulated to get them on a path for citizenship. And if all these DACAs, 850,000 of them, and 17 million illegals were put on a path to citizenship and include a fee for applying for citizenship, that money that they would pay as a fee for their application for citizenship could pay for the wall.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's certainly, I think, the most immediate priority. And I was glad to see, I think it sounds like you were as well, that he came out and said that he supports a path to citizenship. I know he's been on both sides of that. But how do you see it going forward in terms of him being able to maintain his rapport, his core supporters who really rallied around ideas like the wall, ideas like America First that frankly implicitly sort of require less immigration into this country, sort of more jobs for the folks here who are unemployed? How do you see those two matching up in 2018? Do you think he can accomplish both, or is there going to be an issue there?
I think he's going to be able to accomplish a lot more in 2018. The man is not a politician. He is a businessman, and he is running this company like a big business. He's a successful man, and I think with all the successes that we're going to see come, that people would appreciate it, and his core politicians will have more faith in him. I think Washington is in an absolute state of shock that he is sitting there in the presidency of the United States.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nan. Thanks for joining us on NightCAP tonight. Okay. So I'm curious, what are your big takeaways? Meredith, you first.
I just would disagree. I think the presidency is pretty much in shambles at this point, and I think some of the points that you brought up, I mean, I don't know how much of that is Trump or how much of that is just the environment that he came into. National policy, like domestic policy, I don't know how much or any of that can be credited to him. Like when you look at the healthcare debate, like how much he did versus how much Obama did. Obama was out there, he was stumping for Obamacare. He actually knew the policy, and I don't know if we can say the same for Trump. I don't think he even understood it. And then internationally, countries have totally lost respect for America. We're in a horrible place with North Korea. And then there's just like the reputation. He's actually a racist man, and he is a sexual predator, and yet he's our president. And I think that's doing horrible things for America.
Harsh words from Meredith. Matthew, do you disagree with those?
I wouldn't say I disagree with them, but I'd love to ask your grandma how much she's looking to charge Dreamers. Like, that would have to be a
That was an
considerable
interesting
sum
one.
to fund the wall there. I don't know what type of wall she's trying to build, but I mean, I think it is interesting that you still have ardent support from a good swath of this country. President Trump has really, really exceptionally low approval ratings, and when you think about some of the economic numbers, you have to wonder what are going to happen to his approval rating should the economy ever hit a speed bump. But with hovering around 40% approval, that's still hundreds of millions of Americans that have similar sentiments to your grandmother, and I think that we would it would be mistaken to politically discount all of those people, and the power that they wield.
Certainly. But Matthew, I'm curious, so you touched on the economy very briefly. I'm curious, are all of these accomplishments that my grandmother believes that he accomplished in his first year, do you think that they're worth it when you consider all the other drama that's going on with Russia and the Mueller probe, and then looking forward to 2018 if we see Democrats taking over Congress and the likelihood of impeachment filings?
Several questions there. I think that the likelihood of impeachment really hinges on what Mr. Mueller finds and what he recommends. I think that the Republicans learned during Bill Clinton that impeachment is a very risky political move, and I would be shocked that without without some really, really hard convincing evidence if they went down that rabbit hole. But I think in terms of the economy, it's really difficult at this point to assign how much Trump is responsible for the nation's GDP growth. I also think it's really interesting that while Obama was in office and the stock market was still doing well, Mr. Trump was one of the first to say Mr. Obama didn't deserve any of that credit. But you have seen numbers like consumer confidence and business confidence go up, and I think you can attribute some of that to the administration, but I think it's too soon to sit around and say, well, we can say that the stock market is thanks to President Trump.
Well,
So
certainly, yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. And Matthew brought up the approval rating, and while that 30 to 40% is really hard support, as we look ahead to next week's State of the Union address, I think for me at least it'll be interesting to see whether it is a State of the Union address or sort of a State of Trump's America address. And I'm wondering, Meredith, if you think there's a speech that he can give that would actually appeal to any of those people who aren't already with him, that would give them some hope for 2018 ahead.
I don't know how much hope President Trump is going to give. I think it could be an okay speech if he stays on message and doesn't say racist, degrading comments about countries in Africa. But I don't think that he is a man that inspires a lot of people, and unless it's like with some pretty bad ideology.
So then for you, would enough of a speech just be him staying on script like we saw the last time he addressed a joint session of Congress?
Yeah.
Right. I would
talked
think
about
that
that
was
last
a speech that people said was successful for Trump, but it's really just because he read what his speech writers wrote. So
Well, we challenged him, I think that was the last time we were on the air, to see if he could give that good State of the Union address. I don't know, we'll see. I mean, it's Tuesday. We're a couple days out.
I think it'll be very interesting, and actually I do think he will give a similar speech to that joint address, but I think Meredith probably is equally right that it'll maybe fall a bit short of what people are looking for who aren't already with him.
Well, for more on that, you guys can tune in on Tuesday. Both of us will be here, and we're going to give some extra analysis for the Northwestern News Report State of the Union coverage.
Quickly, though, we want to go to a quick news segment where we try to highlight, we're going to call it Extra Extra, where we highlight
Extra, read all about it.
moments where folks are just a little extra around Northwestern. This week, I'm actually a co-recipient of this award.
I feel like this is going to be you every week.
We've got a long list of recipients, but basically these are folks who watched the movies Psalm and Psalm 2 Both.
The sequel.
At least 2 times in the last week. Check that out. It's pretty embarrassing. I'm kind of embarrassed I watched it.
You probably should be. We're going to take a quick break, but if you guys are enjoying the conversation, you can follow along on social media at NightCapNU. We'll be back in a minute.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
This weekend, hundreds of thousands across the country marched in protest for the 2nd annual Women's March. Last year it was just marching. Now we're seeing something a little bit more tangible, another type of march on Washington. This week, Medill alum Rebecca Tracer out with a new piece in the New York Magazine highlighting the record number of female candidates running for office this year. So Meredith, I'm curious, as a woman, do you think that this is finally going to be the year that we see enough female representation in politics that we're actually going to see a difference? I mean, we're coming out of the Me Too movement, all of this kind of stuff.
Saw it happen in Virginia as well.
Yeah.
I would like to hope so. I mean, I think if it's going to happen in any party, it's going to happen in the Democratic Party, and that's where you're seeing a lot of these female candidates running. And I think with enough representation, you can see some real change.
That's great. Well, we're actually going to take a deeper dive on this topic next week when we sit down with Lori Abraham, another Medill alum who is actually the editor for Rebecca Tracer's piece in New York Magazine. But now we want to turn to our favorite segment of the show. In case you missed it, our roundtable is going to let you know if you missed anything this week. So Meredith, let's start with you.
There was a shooting in Kentucky this week in a high school where 18 people were injured and 2 died. And in case you missed it, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, responded 24 hours before our own president did.
Well, thank God for Justin Trudeau.
He's quite the man. Matthew?
In case you missed it, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, the political punching bag during the presidential election, just got ratified. The only thing missing is the United States. 11 of the 12 original countries agreed to what President Trump pulled us out of, and it would seem that the global economic order continues just without the United States' participation.
We were talking about that in my foreign policy class actually yesterday. It was really interesting strategy. It's a pretty big lecture, and the professor split the room in the middle and was like, break off into groups and debate whether you guys think that the United States should pull back or lean forward, which just seems like a weird strategy with that many people. I won't make us do it here, even though that makes more sense.
Technical terms, pull back, lean forward, right there.
Okay, it was the title of the articles that we read for class. What do you have for us?
So I found this week, in case you missed it, 2 of the most milquetoast presidential candidates of all time are going to be running again, it looks like. On the Democratic side, we've got John Kerry. Don't really know that calculus, but on the Republican side, we've got John Kasich, so I look forward to him spoiling the Republican primary again.
Is milquetoast, is that a technical term?
In this case, yes. I can't find a better adjective for the 2 of them, actually. I tried to find one.
And that's my governor you're talking about.
Well, not for long.
Okay, well, we'll see how he does this year. I thought, I'm curious to see how he does in New Hampshire when he goes up there for that event.
Yeah, going to New Hampshire. We definitely running.
Big step. Anyway, we finally get to mine this week. I think we have a picture. We mentioned this earlier. So Susan Collins, one of my favorite senators of all time, Switzerland, as she is lovingly referred to, had this talking stick that she used during the government shutdown. It's reported that she had a meeting, there were all these senators, and she literally passed this talking stick around the room to make sure that grown adults could respect each other. She used a kindergarten strategy. But anyway, here she is on CNN looking at this talking stick, looking at it quite lovingly, I might add. So they tweeted out, find someone who looks at you like this talking stick. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you tonight. But it is only 8:30, plenty of time to keep talking.
Or not. Thanks.
See you next week.